Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Hello and welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education. This is Jamie Saponaro with Jerry Kimball, and we are going to be talking literally about thinking out of the box today. In recent years, K-12 educators have heard more about applying principles of design thinking into curriculum in areas such as problem-based learning. And these ideas have helped students develop critical thinking and problem-solving skills in order to solve those problems that they have authentically in their real lives. The COVID pandemic, of course, has also shown us how important it is to think differently and to reinvent how people do business and how they learn. So who do we have here today, Jerry, to help us through this?
Right. Jamie, we have with us today two design thinking professors. Well, they originally started in design thinking, but they are definitely out of the box thinkers and have moved, I think, beyond design thinking into something that they call Thinknado. We have with us Brandt Williams, who's a professor at Montana State University. And we also have John Bielenberg. He is the author of Think Wrong. Does that tell you something right there?
Yeah, that's right.
Think Wrong. And he's also a TED speaker. And together they have taken design thinking to the next level and created a process that's called Thinknado. So welcome, John and Brandt. We're glad to have you here today.
Great.
Yes. So we're going to have to just start off with, I talked a minute just about design thinking and Thinknado. How are those two things different? As Jamie said, in K-12, we're just now getting to design thinking, and it seems like you took off without us and went on to Thinknado. So what's the difference?
Design thinking was originated by a firm called IDEO, which is essentially a product design company based in Silicon Valley. And it was designed as a methodology to make really good human-centered design products and services, right? So it's a really good methodology that involves ideation and prototyping to design like a mug that's just incrementally better, right? And I think it works really well. What it doesn't do, in our opinion, is come up with really radical ideas and innovations, right? Things that kind of transcend what you can imagine. Sometimes I call it, conceive the inconceivable. And it's really hard to do this if you just go, okay, I'm going to conceive the inconceivable about a mug, right? It's really hard just on your own to do that. So you need some kind of methodology. The other thing Thinknado does, I think, that design thinking doesn't do that well is it's super simple. So anybody can use it. You can be a second grader, you can be a grandmother, you can be a CEO, you can be Elon Musk, right? It's a very simple process, and I'm sure we'll go over exactly what that is soon. So that's, in a nutshell, it's just Thinknado is really to come up with amazingly innovative solutions to big challenges. But they can be small or personal as well.
I would say that if ever there was a time we needed amazing different solutions, it would be now with all of the things that we're facing right now, climate change, racial inequality, just so many things, the vaccine. We just have so many things that need solutions that really we can't bank on the way we used to think to get there.
I think we're in a place in human history that's unprecedented, and it really has to do with the impact of humans on the planet, right? There are more and more humans using more and more resources. We have a finite world that we're using. We have more trash. We have species extinction, something called the sixth extinction going on. And this is kind of unprecedented in human history. And what it means is we can't just keep doing the same things we're doing and expect a positive outcome, right? So the status quo, the way things are, business as usual, really won't get us or the planet, we're not the only ones here, into a place that's kind of sustainable and productive going forward.
And the challenge really is that if humans don't think naturally sort of out of the box, we go to the comfortable places where we can. Our brains are kind of hardwired to go back to known solutions. And so whatever we do, the status quo is constantly pulling us back down to things that we already know, because at some point they may have worked, or they may have worked partially. And what we're advocating in Thinknado is you got to get outside that to be truly innovative. And there's a lot of examples of people that have done that.
So it's got to be transformative, is what you're saying. We can't keep going on that same path. We have to step off. We have to be reflective, right? Look at maybe what didn't work, so that way we can go outside of that to move forward in a completely different mindset, to get us on a different path. Because are we hitting a wall, it seems like, with things that we've been doing, right? We just keep going in circles sometimes.
Yeah, in this really simplistic way, the way our brains hardwire over time, we have these synapses that fire. And if they fire enough times, there's a little neural pathway that's created. And so right now I'm thinking and talking. I don't have to sort of work at vocalization because I have a pre-existing neural pathway, right? I don't get up in the morning and have to relearn how to walk or put my clothes on. So it allows us to function in the world. What it doesn't do is create new neural pathways. Once they're set, it's really hard to change them, right? So an example I use is right now, if I try to talk wrong, if I try to put words together in a nonsensical sequence that doesn't make any sense, completely random, it's almost impossible, right? So even if I try, I'll just be looking around the room, like computer, glass, I can't just do it. And that's because I have a pre-existing neural pathway. And this explains why it's so difficult and so unnerving to imagine things that don't exist, right? Because we're working with a very fixed kind of mindset. There's a really good little interview with Steve Jobs where he's talking about creativity, and he says, all this stuff around us, computers, screens, lights, mugs, desks, was invented by people, right? And so for him, it meant this is the way things are. It doesn't mean it has to be this way. So in essence, he was just talking about the same thing. He was talking about this fixed mindset and these neural pathways that a desk has to be like this. And he was always challenging that notion and inventing products and usability that nobody could imagine at the time.
It's funny too, because a lot of times when we say, no, we can't do that because we are in tune with what we've always done, right? So we say, no, we can't. But then it takes someone else to challenge and say, well, why? And you get down to that root cause, right? You ask why 5 times. And then when you get to a point and think, oh, well, maybe we can do something different. And I think this is sounding like what this is just getting out of your own way to realize there are other ways to do things. We just have to get there. So Thinknado is what helps do that. Why does building a creative capacity through a process like Thinknado matter?
Well, I'll take the first part of that. What's interesting about that is as John said, breaking those synaptic pathways, those hard wiring, will get you to a place that you've never been before. So we're constantly reinforced with things that we know, that we understand. For example, in product development or advertising, we put together focus groups just to reinforce an assumption that may or may not be correct. Those assumptions that are made by those focus groups, for example, or by asking people what they think, is just another reinforcement. But to truly get outside of that area where you're creating you're building this sort of creative muscle, if you will. You have to stretch it. You have to move beyond it, just like you would train for a marathon or lift weights to build more strength. You have to exercise that muscle in your creativity, and your brain then starts working in a different capacity. That capacity starts moving you into places where you're more comfortable. And the more you exercise that, the more you're uncomfortable in that, the more you exercise that capacity, the more likely you are to come up with new solutions that might push you beyond what the status quo is.
Interesting. It's like training.
Yeah, exactly. We don't think about training your brain that way, right? Like making that muscle more powerful or work better. And we should. I was just going to say that, it's scary to do this sometimes, right? Because anything new, there's generally a pushback because of the status quo. If you try to sort of have this bold new idea, the status quo, business as usual, will try to pull that idea down so it fits within the existing paradigm. So there's this fear involved. But if you look at some examples, I mentioned Steve Jobs and Apple before. I think Elon Musk right now, these are what I call natural wrong thinkers. They're just hardwired a certain way to allow them to come up with ideas and have the kind of capacity and wherewithal to make them kind of happen in the world. And if you look at those two companies, the market cap of those companies is unprecedented, right, in American business history. And the reason isn't because of the products they create, it's because of the ability to imagine a future that doesn't exist. That's why they're worth more than GM or any other computer company, right? I always, when I work with clients, I always tell these stories because, people generally want to avoid risk. There's something kind of, elemental about that, risk is bad. You don't want to put yourself in that position. But if you look at the examples, the real risk is to not risk, right? And so there's a hurdle you have to get by. And I just use those business examples. I think you could look at art too, and somebody like Picasso, right, who imagined something that didn't exist. And that's why it's worth more than other substance on earth, right, per square inch.
Yes.
Yeah, and to use that example again, just to lean into art for a moment, which actually bridges art and commerce. If you're familiar with the artist Banksy, who is anonymous, right? And so there was this extremely expensive multi-million-dollar painting that was she was on an auction, and it was in a frame. And the minute the auction closed and the person who won raised their paddle and they won the final bid, it clicked and went into a shredder. Now, this is a perfect example of something that was completely unexpected, completely out of the status quo. And now the person that paid millions of dollars for this object is now has pieces of what it was that they originally bid on. So was that something provocative and interesting and different? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Did it create an experience that was something that was out of the box? Well, absolutely. So it pushed the limits of what Sotheby's or whoever it was that was the auction house to the limits of what they expected, because nobody knew that was going to happen.
Yeah. And then it became worth more.
It did.
It doubled in value as soon as it got shredded. But if you went to Sotheby's and tried to convince them, to shred a painting after the gavel, kind of falls, there's no way they would approve that.
So is the Thinknado process the way that we kind of do the workout for our brain? Is it calisthenics for our brain? Creativity?
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, and that's what we call it. John and I call this the sort of creative conditioning. to build that facility, if you will, and the steps that you go through take you into that realm. And by the way, it's super uncomfortable. I mean, it's not a place that is, you don't go there and go, wow, I'm really happy. I feel really good because I'm completely disjointed and everything that I knew and thought about was there.
Down.
It's not, but it's also super fun.
Right.
So how does it work?
It's kind of a 4-step process, if you will. And we've kind of pulled a lot of what we've been talking about into something that's really simple and really easy to use and is natural language. So I think first thing we do is we say, wait, why? That's the first step. And stopping this process, taking a pause and actually examining what you're looking at, and then asking why it exists in the first place is the first step. So this pause, which we tend to not do when we problem solve. First thing we do is, we got to get an answer real quick because that's what we get paid for, and that's what we do, and this is what we have to do because we're going to lose money, and we're going to wasting resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So we stop, think about what you're doing, think about where you're looking at it, and ask, why does it exist in the first place? And once you start uncovering the whys, you say, well, is that really why it should exist? Or does it exist for a reason? And maybe there are reasons. Maybe there's regulatory reasons, or there's cultural reasons, or there's familial reasons, or there's pressure from your administration, or there's curriculum that you have to live to because it's been approved, right? But that doesn't mean you can't question why it exists in the first place and then maybe modify it. And I certainly do that in my teaching at Montana State. I teach entrepreneurship, and we're constantly uncovering why these things exist. So that's the first step. Wait, why?
Yeah. So an example of that, I think, in education is, wait, why do we all have to go to a classroom at a certain time and sit there and listen at a desk, right? And I think the pandemic has sort of forced that question upon us. And there's certainly value. It's when you're asking these questions, you don't want to say, well, there's there's social value in assembling, but that doesn't mean that you have to go to a room, at a certain time and sit there at a desk, right? So these things just open up these questions, and you should, when going through this step of the process, really let go of orthodoxies and kind of pre-editing those questions or the answers to them. And out of this usually comes something that's most interesting, right? Something that you wouldn't have imagined. And the more questions you ask, the better. And then you look at those whys and go, well, this is really interesting here, which leads to the next step.
And the why is actually a challenge, right? You're challenging what you know. You're challenging what's expected. And that's the key to this sort of creative conditioning is, what are you going to challenge that's expected? The next step would be maybe. And so you start with a question, maybe it's possible. And then maybe it's possible too. And then you look at the sort of spectrum of things that are in the maybe category. And it's, again, you're opening your mind to saying, well, why did it exist? Maybe it's here for a reason. Maybe it's possible to do something else. And you start associating things that are completely out of the realm of possibility. And this is where you bring in things that may not ever be in your collective consciousness. These are things that are really out of the box ideas. John F. Kennedy, let's get to the moon. Maybe it's possible to get to the moon by the end of the decade, right? Those are moonshot ideas, if you will. You heard that in Silicon Valley's moonshot ideas. That's where that came from. And then the next step is, what if? Well, what if it's possible to do this? Maybe you start with maybe, what if, and then you start coming up with a list of possibilities. You start creating things and putting disassociated things together that allow you to put ideas and solutions together that could lead to a possible something. Who knows? And the idea here is to come up with as many ideas as you possibly can based on your maybe.
You have to trick your brain to do this, because as soon as I say maybe it's possible to put a man on Mars, I'm already thinking about spaceships and rockets. Like your mind, that neural pathway is so strong, it goes to a file folder full of everything you know about space travel, what you've seen in movies, right? Which is already limiting the potential of the idea. And so you have to trick your brain. And we have various exercises to do that. We'll show you actually a little bit later. But one exercise is called Be Stupid. So you come up with what's the stupidest idea you could possibly think of, right? And what that does is it forces you to be ridiculous, right? And out of those stupid ideas, you say, okay, take that and then now make it doable, right? So, but if you don't start stupid, you'll stay in that little box. And we'll show you another way to do that later.
Quick question. I know through, as a former teacher and just someone who tries to solve problems, a lot of times I start with the pros and cons. It sounds like you're trying to eliminate the cons list, right? And instead really just focus on even, beyond pros, but outside of anything you would really just typically imagine.
Yeah, it's very easy, especially in groups, for people, the naysayers or the devil's advocates, to start tearing stuff down. This step is about widening, right? And when I work with clients and they resist kind of going out there, I say, okay, wouldn't you rather have this huge universe of possibilities before you start, right? Before you start like asking what's doable and those cons. And it's like, yeah, why wouldn't I want this huge, So this is all about the not editing yet, but just putting crazy stuff out there. And the thinking is, if you start with something really interesting, unusual, creative, unexpected, you can make it doable. You never start with something that's kind of responsible and ordinary, and then later on make it amazing. Never works that way.
You want to disassociate yourself from something that might work. So in our client work, what ends up happening is that people start looking for things that are possible right out of the gate. And that's not the purpose of this step. You want to disassociate yourself. So Jamie, back to your pros and cons, those tend to push you down into things and say, oh, this will work. And now you're back into sort of status quo stuff, or doing expectations. This is completely about disassociating yourself from anything that might even be reality. So for example, the Be Stupid example gets you into some really crazy stuff, and it can be super fun. I mean, it ends up being this sort of game, if you will, that says how stupid could be. That's stupid, but this could be stupider. And then you start picking apart pieces of those things that actually might be, available to you to the next step. And the next step is try this. And that's where you start pulling these ideas, these bigger ideas, down into something that have the ability to actually test. You want to test them. So you want to make what we like to call small bets. You say, okay, I'm just going to try this little thing and see what the reaction is. Not whether it works or it doesn't, just the idea. So the what if step is enormous. It's big. Now we're going to start bringing it into a place where we can test it and see if it's going to work. Silicon Valley calls these different things, but that's kind of where the core is. So those 4 steps: wait, why, maybe, what if, and then try this.
Steve Jobs might have used something like this. I was talking to someone that was on his iPhone team, and he would not allow anyone to talk with anyone that had made a phone in the past or had anything to do with a telephone when they were creating the iPhone, because he didn't want them to kind of go back to that old thinking.
Apple was talking to me about being design director in the early 2000s, and Steve Jobs had come back and as they were taking me around, I said, well, why don't you guys do a phone? And they said, Steve will never do a phone. He's going to do a computer and we'll call it a phone. And I remember thinking, I have no idea what you're talking about. Because in my mind, I was just thinking a really cool Apple designed cell phone. And Steve, there was no way he was going to do that.
Oh, that's so funny. That's so funny. Because that's what it is. You're holding a computer. And that's what I used to refer to it as. This is my computer.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Well, it has replaced a lot of those devices. We have Apple roots. When I was at Apple, I was there during the time that they were developing the Newton, if anybody remembers what the Newton is. And that was being prototyped when we were, there. And that Newton was a brilliant device, way ahead of its time in many ways. And back in those days, it was called a PDA. But
yes, right.
You look at where those kinds of ideas have transmogrified into things that are far more compelling and interesting. And if they started off with the idea that they were going to have a handheld computer, then they would never have come up with, what is now ubiquitous in a smartphone, for example.
When I was teaching in the 90s, I taught science. And so part of my science curriculum was technology education. So it wasn't educational technology, like using different, web-based tools. It was technology education, and we used the problem-solving cycle. And then as, I moved on in life, I realized the problem-solving cycle is great, but it certainly is limiting. It definitely took into consideration the importance of reflection, because I think that is part of what is happening here. But it definitely had a level of, being a little more restricted, too comfortable, I think. And I think what's so interesting about this model is that it allows you to think big, right? My mom always said, go big or go home. So it allows you to think big. But as you said, it is so simple. And so we can do this at the primary level with students, as well as, high school, college, and adults. So I think that's what's so brilliant about it.
Our experience, Jamie, with when you do it with young kids is they're the freest of all. So they just sort of dive in and say, yeah, great. Yes. Oh, maybe it's possible to, I can't think like a second grader, but yeah. They really get to places that we can't, because we've got too much history in solving problems. And they don't know risk, right? They don't care about risk. What's that? They don't care. Yeah. And if you tell them to be stupid, that's like the best thing in the world, right? Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right. And the challenging thing is getting the instructor, and at all levels, it doesn't matter from grade school. Yes, absolutely. Is to say, well, I'm going to embrace this for my own curriculum. And so I was handed a couple of years ago when I started teaching at Montana State, I was handed this curriculum and said, here it is. And I went, okay, this is great. Yeah. Super great guy, developed it, PhD, business guy, right? But I was galvanized by doing startups and working at large corporations. And I went, okay, well, this is great. It's terrific curriculum, but I'm going to Thinknado this thing. So I took the curriculum, lived within the approved, boundaries of the learning outcomes, and then just flipped it on its ear on how it was going to be delivered. So the learning outcomes were identical. How it's delivered is completely different. Absolutely. It's all about the process. It is. And the Thinknado process sort of got me to a place where I could go through it. And that's just one example. Of applying it in an educational setting. Yeah, Jerry and I worked on a project a year or so ago to reinvent the school in Lawrence, Kansas. And we worked with elementary schools and high schools. And we ran Thinknados first with, was it third graders? Yes. Second and third? Yes. And they were, as Brandt said, wildly creative, right? They didn't even really need any prompt. They just started drawing crazy schools. This one kid had one with this kind of killer clown with a bloody knife on it. Like, they were totally unedited. Then we did it with high school kids. They were very sincere, much less creative. We did it with teachers
who were the worst, because they're in the middle of it. They feel constrained by budgets and curriculum and requirements. And so it's really hard for them to get out of, the status quo. And we did it with with parents. And they were pretty good because they were the ones that showed up were very motivated. But that just shows how this muscle, this creative muscle, actually gets atrophied and engineered out of us, know.
Wow.
And it doesn't have to be that way. And I think the process helps to do that.
I also think the system has really led to that as well, has kept us from being creative. The school system and the testing and all of the regulations have really pushed teachers down in their creativity.
Yeah.
That's the gravitational pull of status quo that pulls you down to staying on that line and doesn't allow you to really take off and start thinking about something that's radically different. That doesn't mean you can't get the same outcomes. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get to the learning outcomes. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that you're not going to be able to do it the exact same way. And I laugh because, because of COVID, we're doing hybrid learning like everybody else is. And I've got a classroom that can hold 28. I can only have 14 in there. And I have this sort of half in, half out, classroom because I've got 28 students. How do I deal with that? And, oddly enough, we're having more success by doing it like this in Zoom or with video, et cetera. We're having more success in creating a space where students can learn and find, reach inside their brains, if you will, and their creative muscle by not necessarily being in the classroom.
Right.
So there are ways to do it. You just can't do it the same way.
Right.
And
did you Thinknado all that?
That process?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I figured you did. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. We took it all apart and said, well, why are we doing it this way? And that was it. I did this. Wait, why are we doing it this way?
Right.
John and I have been talking about this forever. And it, quite frankly, it's really simple, but it really, really works.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's about training yourself to get there too.
And accepting the process. You have to be able to accept that what you're going to do is going to be worthwhile. And that's a big hurdle for humans too. It's like, wait a minute, that's different. I don't like that. And whenever we do a like a consulting gig with an organization, I'll say that, you can identify the skeptics right away. And I always feel it's fun to challenge and find that skeptic and say, okay, I'm going to break that.
Of course you do.
Well, it's just kind of fun, right? Because at the end, you realize, oh, I didn't think we were going to get there. And look where we got. And it's 100% of the time, that's the admission that we get from the skeptic.
Sure. John, you started talking about applying it in education, and I have a question about that. As you do, and as we do that, how does collaboration play? I mean, I know that when I incorporate cooperative learning, I see bigger, brighter ideas when students are collaborating. Is there a portion of this process where students, though, also need to be independent with their thoughts? I make sure I try to do that too, as part of collaboration. How does that all come into play? Yeah,
the collaboration is really useful because you have a bunch of different minds with different kind of file folders full of stuff that if I'm just sitting here at my desk, trying to kind of Thinknado myself, I don't have anyone to bounce stuff out. I don't have anyone to collaborate on prototyping, right? So I think that's really useful. Where you don't want that to get in the way is the actual idea generation. So a lot of times in the what if stage, we'll give prompts, and I'll show you in a second, one of them, and they work individually at that point. So you're not thinking, oh, someone else isn't going to like this, or not waiting for a more dominant personality to speak up before you do. So it kind of goes back and forth, but you need both.
Yes. Right. And it's the kind of that think, pair, share, right? So I always say you have to be alone with your thoughts, right? And so then they can collaborate, and that brainstorming session is, and I always try to do in the classroom, and I think is what you're saying in your process, is no one's idea is wrong. It's an idea. Right. So we can't be critical of ideas. We're brainstorming, we're throwing these out there, and they're all sticking to the wall right now at this point.
Right, and it's why we emphasize wrong. Because it's giving permission to be wrong. And I think especially in school, but also in corporate life, you're encouraged to be right. Right? Yes. You're supposed to have the right answer on that test. And so I think using wrong as a frame helps to kind of combat that rightness.
Yes.
Well, what's interesting about the word test is when you, in the empirical sense, testing is to find a result. It's not necessarily to get the answer, get the right answer. So we've changed the word in education. I think we've changed the word test to mean that you have to be proficient and exemplary, rather than the true meaning of the word in the scientific empirical sense. The test is actually to just find an outcome.
Yeah, and also to find things that are wrong too, right? That aren't working, to QA it, right? So it's testing.
A good example of that are sticky notes, right? The 3M little sticky notes, and that was a mistake. It was a glue. It was a temporary glue that didn't work, and so they were using it in the laboratory, and they were rubbing it on pieces of paper and putting notes up. And somebody came in, and probably some marketing guy came in and said, "Those are really cool. I want some of those for myself." And then it turned into a ubiquitous product that we all
can't live without.
Right.
Before we finish, I want to show the toolkit that we've developed. So originally, this is the Think Wrong book, which it's great. It's a book. You have to read it. Has utility, but I don't know that it's that useful on a day-to-day basis. So Brandt and I developed this. It's the Thinknado tornado thinking toolkit. So what we call this tornado thinking because it's like a tornado comes in and everything's spinning around, and then eventually it settles down to earth, and you have to put stuff back together. And the way this works, it's really simple. You could do this with second graders. So you start with these weight Y cards, and you pick one of those, and it's a topic. This particular one is family. Here's aging, science, right? So you need to start community. It can be anything really. And out of this, you come up with a maybe it's possible to statement. So family, maybe it's possible to connect family like before television, right?
Right.
So how would you do that? Then there are two what if cards. There are black ones and white ones. On the black one, it has an image, this little kid yelling into a microphone. And then the white ones have a word on it, deranged child, right? So these are randomly put together. And let me find another one. So you put together a word and an image. Here we have deranged graffiti. So the concept here is when you start with something random and this pairing, it's completely separate from the challenge. Okay, so you have deranged kid yelling into a microphone. How do you connect family like before television? Right. So all of a sudden you can't go to that file folder in your brain.
Right.
Because as soon as I said before television, I'm thinking, okay, people could, read books, play games, radio, I'm already in that box. But when you say, deranged kid yelling, I'm not in that box, right? So then you have to form new pathways and try to solve that. Right. So, and it's hard. This is the muscle thing. A lot of times when we do this for the first time, people are just sitting there with their eyes glazed because you're not used to doing this.
It's not comfortable. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But the Brandt's really good at coaching. And he's like, it doesn't have to be a real microphone, right? It doesn't have to be a kid, right? So what's happening? There's emotion in that picture, right? So you can kind of unpack it and make it, doable. But it's just a way to get you to form new pathways versus rely on the existing ones.
Right.
Part of that training.
And the toolkit comes with a series of cards in a box, and a series of cards. You have lots and lots of choices to sort of really move out of the space.
Yeah.
Love it.
You could do it as an individual. You could do it as a game with your family or friends, or you could do it with a classroom of kids. Today we're going to talk about, climate change, right? And then maybe it's possible, right? So you could just do the same thing.
Absolutely. I see it in the classroom. I see it as part of retreats for corporations as well.
Right.
To get people thinking in different ways. It's totally relatable and helps with that training to get us off that path that we're constantly on.
We've done it with nuns.
Come on. I love it. I love it.
Oh.
And you know what? Super creative. And you talk about living in a status quo world.
Yes.
2,000 years of indoctrination.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And,
oh my gosh.
And it's super fun. And, and these aren't like 25-year-old nuns. These are 75.
Right. Definitely set in their way. Love it. Love it.
I'm thinking about the two cards you just held up with the little kid yelling and the deranged, and then going back to family. And I'm thinking, what is the deranged message that we have been holding on to in society that maybe we need to get away from and go back to family? It just really, really got my mind reeling in just that couple of seconds that you held those cards up, because it does. Your mind just has to start churning.
Maybe this is the deranged thing.
It could be the deranged thing. Right. It might not be the microphone. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Technology kind of pushes us apart from each other.
Absolutely. But I can see just you holding those cards up for a second just made me start spinning, in my mind about what could this be? What could this be? I could see where it really would help people.
Jerry, you could apply it exactly as you discussed. It says, what is the status quo and why is it the way it is, and start applying those ideas. But imagine if you did that not only in the classroom, but you did it personally too. And then say, well, okay, what are the choices I want to make for my next chapter, if you will, as I move forward as an instructor or as a student or as a living life or as a family member. And you can take the same process and just move it into that without any reservation or at all. And it's seamless, right?
Right. And I love this because it goes back to what John was saying too. We think about, well, this is the way it is, but that was just some human being's idea of the way it is.
Sure.
My idea could be just as good. I don't have to hold on to those old ideas. I can do something completely different. I love that. It's just empowerment, really.
Zoom has done a lot of things with the pandemic. And you can imagine right now you have, I'll use universities and colleges all around the country, basically recreating the same material. So you can be in, Camden Community College, in New Jersey, and taking English literature, and there's a course at Harvard in the same, the same topic. Why we don't need to do that anymore, right? So you could have everybody have a Harvard education using technology, and then you figure out how to fill in the social part or the project part or the collaboration part. You know what I mean? Whereas before, I wouldn't even imagine that there was an alternative to that model.
Well, and this sort of brings into challenge the entire notion of this sort of structured education, that in some ways we're sort of going back to the future in a way that we're looking at certificate programs, for example, or apprenticeships or internships where you learn. And I envision a world where this sort of factory education that we've been living in for hundreds of years, really since the Industrial Revolution, we're moving into a place where it's experience rather than just learning. So it now becomes knowledge and experience is the driver to expertise. And so I look at things like, if you're a plumber or an electrician, you have this apprentice program, you pay your dues, you do your time, you learn as you move forward, and now you get a certificate that you're a master electrician or a master plumber. Those are trade examples, but imagine, if you will, if you did that, you applied that to marketing. I mean, medical education is the same way, right? You go to school, you learn a few things, you have your book learning, your school learning, if you will, but you're immediately immersed into practice, right? You start doing rotations, and that is no different than if you're an electrician. So doctors out there would say it's a little bit different, but you get the idea that it's experiential learning. And I think that most of our education, K through 4 years of college, really isn't geared for experiential learning. And what we're trying to do with Thinknado is really force that brain to start pushing you into places where you're relying on not just your own experience, but now how do we create more experience? How do we create more ideas that come out of this that you can try?
It's about thinking. And we have to learn stuff, but we also have to learn how to learn. We have to learn how to think. And it's taking that and being able to apply it directly into what they're doing. My daughter is a freshman at Drexel, and their program is all co-op based. I mean, they don't have summers because they are in entry-level positions. So that way, when they are graduating, then they are able to move beyond that. And it really, and I actually saw also, she's in fashion program there, but they have an entrepreneurship program as well. And I'm seeing that in a lot of schools. And I think it's so important because it's really showing, it can be for anything, but it's learning how to think.
Right.
So,
it's not what you know, it's what you do with what you know.
Mm-hmm. And putting it into practice. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That application. So Thinknado is a verb. And how did we, I'm part of you now. How did you come up with the Thinknado?
We came up with the process first, right? A simpler version of the thinking wrong. And then wanted something that sounded fun and interesting. And we had a whole bunch of, Post-its and words up and putting combinations together like the, deranged kid, kind of things. So think was one of them. And I think maybe we had tornado and then the whole Sharknado, it's funny,
Right.
I think that movie was successful because it was called Sharknado, right? And I think that's what it was. We thought it was too silly, or at least I did. Maybe Brandt didn't feel that. But it came out of a Thinknado process. We were in Montana about a year or so ago, and
we were actually driving to a hike, and we were trying to figure out what the heck this was, and we were frustrated because we had probably 50, 100 Post-it notes all over my living room, and we're thinking about names, and we were being very conventional, and it just was breaking. We said, we got to get out of here. So let's go see some sights. And we're driving to this hike, and we went, well, God, it's just like a tornado. You're constantly thinking about this thing. And somebody blurted out Thinknado. I can't remember who it was. And it just sort of stuck. And we sort of, not, I don't want to say argued, but we sort of debated whether or not it was just too ridiculous or not. And then you start looking at the metaphors of what a tornado is, and how our actually brains work, where it sort of picks up stuff indiscriminately and it tosses away because silly, right? Or it doesn't work, or it's some cow goes flying out of the tornado, or a piece of straw goes into a tree and sticks into a trunk, and it's like, well, that's inconceivable. Well, that's what this is. You're coming up with the inconceivable to create things that are the next thing. So it just kind of stuck.
Yes. And I thought it was because John was at the University of Kansas and we have the tornadoes.
It was conceived in Montana. No tornadoes.
Okay. All right. But yeah, there are a lot of connections with a tornado. I love that. Love that.
This has certainly gotten us to think a little differently, a lot of, why nots. And I'm hoping to apply this in what I do in my personal life, what I do in my professional life, and also in what I do with the coaching and mentoring teachers. It brings me back to when I taught science, and I wish we were able, I had elements of this, but not, this process is perfect because it is so simple, and it really just gets you to think differently. So I appreciate this conversation immensely.
And Jamie had notified me this morning that we needed to do a presentation or something about our podcast. So I think we need to Thinknado it now.
We're going to Thinknado it.
Yes,
yeah.
I think so.
We are.
Thank you both so much for being here today. And I mean, the possibilities of Thinknado and the need for it now in the world that we live in to think differently and get really creative about solving the problems that we do have in this world right now. Maybe you can be on the White House team and help them solve some big problems in the future.
I think that's essential. And we certainly need this in education because we do. We need students who are going to be able to Thinknado to solve the problems that we have in the future. So they need to be starting now.
Yeah,
yes.
Sure. One of the key things is it has to be fun. Thinknado is fun and it sounds fun. You can imagine a teacher coming into a class and going, okay, it's Thinknado Thursday, like, yay.
Yes.
I have a colleague, he's a famous ad guy named Alex Bogusky, and he said, saving the world has to be fun or nobody's going to do it.
Very true. Very true. Now, a teacher could pick up your kit and actually incorporate that into a classroom from elementary through high school, the Thinknado kit, couldn't they?
Yeah, they're in production now. They'll be available very soon.
Okay, good.
And soft plug, you can go to our website to learn more about it at thinknado.com.
Okay, great. We'll link it in the show notes too.
And where else can people find you if they want to find out more about Thinknado? Thinknado.com? That's
probably the best place. There's a little blurb on each of us, and then there's a contact form there. But you can find us at Brandt, BRANDT at thinknado.com, and John, JOHN at thinknado.com as well.
Perfect.
And you can pre-order the tool.
Oh, great.
Perfect.
Very good.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you both for being here today. It was such a pleasure to have you on our podcast. And we learned so much, and Jamie and I are going to put it to use.
Yes, we are.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube.